leading stories, trending topics, changing narratives. This is the Critical Conversations podcast series. Welcome to the Critical Conversations podcast series, everyone. My name is Dr. Rick Daniels, and I serve as the Director of Institutional Equity and Inclusion here at Oakton College. It is a pleasure and an honor to greet you in our first episode together. This is going to be a really exciting time, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you on topics that are related to and focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm going to start this off with the segment entitled 3 Things I Learned This Month. 3 things I learned this month. So we're going to do a monthly podcast, and I'm going to try to bring back some new information for you, or at least some inspiration for you every time that we get together. So here we go. 3 things that I learned this month. I had the opportunity to attend a conference in Savannah, Georgia recently by the Society of Human Resources Management, also known as SHRM. And this conference was focused on inclusion, and a couple of takeaways that I know resonated with me that I think just may resonate with you. The first one was the idea of value association. And one of the session presenters talked about the ways in which humans associate value. Some people associate value with being right. Some people associate their value with being agreed with. Some people associate their value with being able to be in a position of authority. And if they're not in a position of authority, it makes them question their value as a human being. I think this resonated with me a great deal because I struggled with that personally. I used to think that if someone agreed with me, they weren't just agreeing with the point that I was trying to make, but they were agreeing that I was a good person. Conversely, if someone disagreed with me, then it made me feel like they weren't just disagreeing with my point, or my position, but they were disagreeing with who I was as a person. And so I would find myself in these really contentious, sometimes long and arduous debates and conversations with people where I was trying as hard as I could to defend my point, example after example, and all different ways to try to be persuasive. And I remember being in a conversation with someone and they said, "You're trying so hard to defend your point right now, I don't even know if we can continue." And I actually tried even harder to defend my point after they said that. The reason why that got under my skin that day was not because of the point that I was trying to make, but because I associated what that person said to me with my value as a human being. And so I encourage everyone to think about what you associate value with. Your own personal value. Is it associated with being right? Is it associated with being heard? Is it associated with feeling comfortable in certain spaces? What do you attribute value to? I think in conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, topics that can be really difficult to discuss at times, our value is sometimes attributed to whether or not people agree with us, or whether or not people hear what we have to say, or whether or not we're communicating our point clearly. But I want you to know that your value as a human being is not based on any of those things. All of us have value. All of us contribute something to the landscape. Even if we have divergent backgrounds or points of view, our value should be associated with who we are as human beings and what we bring to the environment at Oakton College. Another idea that came up at this conference was the idea of your whole self versus your authentic self. And so what does that mean? The session presenter talked about the difference between bringing your whole self to work and bringing your authentic self to work. And a lot of the conversations that we have around DEI, we talk about bringing the whole self or the authentic self. And those two terms can be used interchangeably, but I think there's a difference. Personally, I bring my authentic self to work every day, but that was a learned behavior, a practice that I had to develop over time. I wasn't always in a position where I felt that I could be fully authentic. What I've learned was that over time, I've always brought my authentic self to work, but I didn't bring my whole self to work. The reason for that is because I believe that as a human being, I reserve the right to reserve some of myself from the work environment. There may be parts about me that you don't know, or things that I may not necessarily care for you to see. Things that happen in my personal life that maybe even good things that I just don't feel fully comfortable with sharing. And that's okay. But if you're coming into work and you don't feel like you can bring your authentic self, well, that speaks to a different part of the cultural climate and the environment. And so I want you to take some time to think about that. Do I bring my authentic self to work? Do I bring my whole self to work? Or am I bringing a shell of myself? A part of me that is only reserved for the workplace, but I don't always feel comfortable bringing either. The third and final thing that I want to share with you is the concept of empathy mapping. Empathy mapping being a brief but very powerful framework to gauge and take stock of how much empathy you may be showing in a particular situation. Now, notice I said how much empathy you may be showing in a situation, not someone else. When we have the conversation about empathy, often we project outwards and talk about who among us may be able to show more or may be lacking in empathy. But I want you to look inward and ask yourself, am I lacking empathy in a certain situation? The empathy map contains 4 points. Number 1 is pain points. Number 2 is feelings. Number 3 is influences. And number 4 is the overall goal. And so this framework caused me to sit back and ask myself about where I am on the empathy scale when thinking particularly about the conflict in Israel and in the West Bank. So I asked myself, what's causing me pain in this situation? What's happening that's causing me to feel a certain way? And then what are those feelings? What forces are influencing the way that I feel? And then what's my overall goal in this situation? Now, I know it may seem a little bit selfish to think about yourself in a moment like this, but I would argue that we have to. We have to take stock of ourselves. We have to think about where we land. We have to think about how we demonstrate empathy, because each of us have an impact on the student and the employee experience. And when we lack empathy, oh, trust me, people know. So ask yourself, what's causing me pain about this conflict? How do I feel about it? What influences are causing me to feel a certain way? And then what is my overall goal? Is it to learn more? Is it to be more compassionate? Is it to be better at understanding what's happening geopolitically? All of these things are very powerful ways that can help us to show more empathy, especially in times like these. So that's just a brief segment. Once again, 3 things that I learned this month. I'm going to try to do this every time that we talk and try to offer some different ideas and thoughts and perspectives that will hopefully be of influence to you in a positive way. All right, everybody, it's now time for us to transition into our core content. Today's episode is entitled The Oakton Report, examining the current anti-DEI movement and the resulting impact on the student and employee experience. Our subject focuses on the ways in which DEI programs are facing legal challenges, threatening the existence of such initiatives as Affinity Groups, identity-based student organizations, anti-racism training, and more. Today, we are joined by Frank Garrett, an attorney at Robbins Schwartz and the college's legal counsel. Frank, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dr. Daniels. Glad to be here.
Great to have you. Frank, let's get right into it. I recently had the opportunity to attend an outstanding webcast on this subject, and it was put on by you and your colleagues at the firm. So the first question I want to ask is for you to talk a little bit about some of the benefits and the challenges facing this work. Can you tell us about the current state of DEI in higher education and some of the challenges and opportunities that leaders face as it relates to this work?
Sure. Be happy to talk about that. For the last couple of years, I've certainly have been following DEI and the challenges that not only employers, but especially higher education institutions are facing. There's no question that there's been a backlash or a movement against the whole concept of DEI. Much of that, I think, comes from a misunderstanding of what it really is. But whether it's in the legal space or even in the governmental legislative spaces, there has been certainly a movement to cut back or eliminate DEI programs, DEI offices throughout the country. So there is that movement that I think folks are feeling even now, where a lot of laws have been passed that are prohibiting colleges from having DEI or DEI conversations, looking at DEI in a way to, I would say, limit it to the extent that they can. some of this, Dr. Daniels, I think, is certainly an unfortunate part of our society, where there's just simply a lot of division among folks for a variety of reasons, and a lot of misunderstandings and an unwillingness to work together.
Yeah.
So we saw the Supreme Court decision in June, which struck down the use of race in student admission at colleges. So that certainly has been generated a movement toward those who are not proponents of DEI to use that to say the law requires us to eliminate or to change it.
Do you think those are two camps, if you will? You have people who are anti-DEI that seem to be driving forces towards rolling back the DEI movement. And then there are those who are reactors and responders to it, although they may in some ways be relieved that it's happening.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there are gradations of that. I certainly think that in all of my research and looking at this topic, clearly there are folks that were never proponents of DEI and forever, back in my day when we called it affirmative action, forever thought that we didn't need that. There was no need for that. It's illegal. It's unfair. So there's that camp. And what you had asked earlier, I think there are folks also in the other camp that are, no one likes to be sued, right? No one likes to go through the legal cost and being in court. So the idea of having to be sued or challenged, I think, has caused some folks to look at cutting back or saying that we need to cut back or we need to change it and the law requires us to do that. So I think that's there, but I don't think that's, directly connected. My thought is that there's a big push and a big challenge, which the Supreme Court decision gave movement toward the opponents of DEI.
Right.
And I think
almost
there's
permission.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think those folks who are not wanting it or see it as unfair, some folks see it as unfair, let's just call it as it is. Some folks just think that
being DEI in general. Okay.
Yeah. And as you know, when we say DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, there are so many different types of initiatives and measures within that acronym that I think folks forget about. I mean, certainly there are a lot of DEI initiatives that are certainly legal, do not use race, don't need to use race, are used as more of a support-based system for those individuals who need it, whether it's for retention, whether it's for support. Those, I think, I'm afraid, could get washed away in this backlash, and I don't think at all that's what the court cases are saying.
That's actually a great segue into the next question. You talk about initiatives, and one of the suggestions made in the webinar was to train all hiring team members on non-discrimination law, institutional policies, and implicit bias. But I'm starting to wondering if the current backlash will also impact training opportunities around DEI-related topics as well. What are your thoughts about DEI training programs and how training and education around this topic, around this work, will affect the current state?
Yeah, that's a great point. I do think, for those folks who are looking to pare down their DEI efforts or to get rid of them, there's a thought that we don't need to do this. We can do this on our own. We don't need trainers. The idea of whether that's going to be a cost is something that as an institution we don't need to do. The idea that even beyond the trainers, folks who are now speaking and training or presenting on DEI are thought of, sometimes I think, we can do that without you. Mm-hmm. We can handle that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a problem. I'm a big proponent of training. I think whether it's DEI or other areas, the more you can educate folks on a topic, I think the better served they are, and the better they can serve their community and themselves. I think that training in the DEI space is almost just a mandatory topic. And there will be differences. There will be different training for different folks. For example, training for those who are required to implement your DEI programs or to develop them or craft them certainly is going to be different than training you may have for other employees who just need to know what the college's policies are, what they can and cannot do, what they should be doing.
Right.
Those are different things. So I do think the idea that no training, I think, is a big concern, but I think you're right. There is that mindset out there that, do we really need to do this? And I think you do.
Yeah, I agree. Personally, I believe that institutions are going to be better served thinking of new language around training and education. And instead of just talking about training, how are we offering educational experiences that allow for people to see themselves in the work that needs to be done? Yeah. Whereas a lot of training really hits on the individual pieces, which I think are valuable, but can also be open to legal challenges as well. Sure. So to support your point about training on the necessary components, policies, procedures, and yes, making the connection to the individual. But I think education is the next phase of language we should start using.
And if I could just jump on that, that's because you raised a really good point in the broader sense. The backlash and I think the challenges to DEI in general and what the law says can and cannot be used, whether it's race or, I think what it does, and I would encourage those folks who are passionate about it, not to look at it, oh, this is a loss or we can't do this, is to use it as an opportunity to look at other language or other facets that we can build upon. For example, in the court's decision, it said, well, you can't use race in your student admission policies. It's got to be race neutral. So, you can't have a sliver of students that are Black or Hispanic and then therefore get them in simply because of their race. But what you can do is you can look at more money for recruitments. You can look at more resources once you have folks here to retain them. We're going to talk about affinity groups. So I think what I would encourage folks to do in the face of the challenge is to take it and say, what can we do differently? Maybe we've been on the same track in thoughts of what it should look like too long, but let's get together. Let's talk about what are some of the things that we can do so that we can still achieve those results that are important to the institution.
Yeah, well said. In the latter part of your answer, you talked about getting together. And that takes me to affinity groups, the coming together of groups of people to be in a space where they can have a sense of community. It was also stated in the webinar that affinity groups provide a forum for discussing and uniting around shared experiences, issues, and goals. But one of the most challenging issues is membership and the safety of the space that these groups occupy. What do you say to affinity groups who are concerned about opening their spaces to people who may not share their experiences or have the same goals?
Sure.
What do you say about affinity groups who are concerned about the safety of their space?
Yeah, and I've received a lot of questions in my various talks and webinars on that issue. It's certainly a passionate issue about folks of like experiences, like cultures, like minds, who have affinity groups that are designed there to support them, to be an extra resource, and to also help them as maybe one of, if they are in a place where they are in the minority. And so the affinity group concept is a great one. It allows someone to join in with folks in regular meetings to discuss things that are particular to them, particular to that group, and provide that sort of resource and support. Now, as I've talked and looking at this from a legal aspect, we shared in our webinars that the Department of Education and the case law has made clear, I think, that affinity groups need to be also open to folks who are not of that particular group membership, let's say Black employees, but want to be a member of the affinity group. So maybe you have an Hispanic employee who wants to join, or a white employee that wants to join. I think the law says that has to be at least offered. And so what does that mean? And I was thinking more about that. I think affinity groups can have rules and guidelines about membership. And while I'm hesitant, because I don't think the law allows it to be limited to a particular race, culture, gender, I do think they can have rules that require someone to have the same mission or vision or identify with the issues of importance to that affinity group, so that you don't have someone in that group that is not of the same community and they're there just to blow it up or to cause unsafe experiences and things like that. Because that's a real concern.
I was going to say that's a very real concern.
No question about it. That is a real concern.
So I guess my question to that is, how do you measure that? If we're an affinity group and you mentioned opening the space to people who have, a shared vision, shared goals, a shared idea, how do you measure that? Sure. Yeah. And when those ideas become divergent, what is the organizational process for ensuring that the space remains safe?
Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, you raise a good question. How do you do that? What would that look like? One thing I thought of, and I'm sure there are tons more, is that anyone that wants to be a member of this affinity group should be required to fill out some sort of application or form that explains what their interests are, what they're looking to get from it, what are their visions of the group, something that can be formed that would at least provide some level of comfort that this person belongs there. And if someone were to say, well, that's illegal, you're keeping people out. No, if we're going to keep people out, we're going to keep people out not because of their race or their culture, but because they're not aligned with the goals of this group. And I think that's defensible. I think you can do that. The other question you raised about, well, what's the mechanism? Say we have groups and we're having a meeting, we're having events, and it becomes clear that there's a person or person that's in the group that is really not in line, is trying to blow it up, or is being difficult and making folks feel unsafe because of their comments or their behaviors. I think that affinity groups, unfortunately or fortunately, should now develop guidelines on group membership and how that group membership is going to be evaluated and looked at. And if there's someone that is acting or speaking in a manner that causes them to feel unsafe, or someone to make clear that they're taking a position totally opposite of the group, that there is some sort of removal process. I think, as any organization is legally authorized to do. Yeah, right? I think, and it's one thing that, especially in higher education, that's not something I think like to do. You get to that point, you don't. You hope everyone would be progressive and understanding enough that we don't need to get to a removal or formal process. But I think knowing that, or at least in me, believing that the law requires them to be open affinity groups to those who may want to join, there should also be a process to remove folks that join, but then later on find out that they're not really there for the reasons the group has been implemented.
Agreed. And I think to your point about the ability to opt in or out, that provides a purpose for someone who may decide that this isn't the group for me, and that perhaps I should find a space where I can be better suited for my needs.
Yeah, Dr. Dan. I mean, real quick.
Sure, go ahead.
That's perfect, because and I think sometimes we don't want to think so narrowly or so stereotypically to think that just because, say, I'm a black man, I'm going to want to be in this affinity group. Or I have the same, concerns or thoughts or challenges. Not necessarily. There may be an overriding one, certainly. But there could be the idea that someone, if we're talking about a black affinity group, Hispanic affinity group, meet those requirements because you're in that race or national origin, but later on you decide it's just not for me, or it's not something that, it's not meeting my needs. So those individuals should be free to feel like, well, we're going to, drop out. There's a process we can't hold you into that group, but there should be also some sort of exit process to find out what went on there.
Agreed.
Yeah, on this issue, it is one that I envision there'll be a lot more discussion on.
Last question I want to bring up for you is around public statements. And this is one of the topics that I think is really top of mind for many college administrators. Recently, there's been a conversation taking place in higher ed around the resurfacing of the Calvin Report from 1967, which discusses the university's, or in this case, the college's role in political and social action. And so I want to read an excerpt from that report and get your take on this in a two-part question. From time to time, instances will arise in which the society or segments of it threaten the very mission of the university and its values of free inquiry. In such a crisis, it becomes the obligation of the university as an institution to oppose such measures and actively defend its interests and its values. So my question is, how does an institution determine when an instance in society threatens its mission and values? And how can that institution defend its interests and values without being exposed to legal challenges?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and very unique, I think, to higher education. I think folks generally understand that at a college or in a university, you are educating students of all types, all ages, all backgrounds, and often there's a lot there that the students will learn from kind of the free speech forums and areas of a college. I think if a college can look at its mission or vision statements, that's where I think it starts.
Yeah.
And my belief is that many would believe that their mission is to make sure that they have a diverse, differing campus that allows for the freedom for all ideas to be spoken on in a respectful manner. And so I sometimes see that as the mission of the college. I do think that in most mission statements, that would include things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mm-hmm. And I think that would be built into that. So with the threats and challenges to that, I certainly understand that there are, maybe when you look at the institutions, whether it's the board of trustees or presidents, it's like, okay, what can we say without being legally challenged? I think certainly they can stand up, and I think I've seen this much, for the value in what they believe in having, whether it's different individuals, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's gender, race, national origin, ethnicity, we can go through all of them, that they believe in that. And they believe in the ability for all people to be educated in a way that speaks to their unique and diverse needs. Mm-hmm. And by speaking to that, I don't think that's creating any legal challenge. I think no one's going out there to say that I've heard that we're not going to respect the Supreme Court's decision. And again, that's a narrow decision, but I don't think you have to say that. But I do think, and I've seen folks say, we believe in this and we're going to continue. And I've directed my staff to continue to look for ways, whether it's in the student or the employee space, to make sure that we are following our vision to still provide a diverse environment for us, because that's what we believe in.
But, one of the things in the report, at least from my opinion, is positioned on this idea that the college or institutions of higher education in general should be neutral in these kinds of times. Do you think that institutions should stay away from making public statements? And if so, under what circumstances should they speak out?
Yeah. I think what institutions look to is how is it impacting the institution and the students they are serving and learning from. For example, whether we have to look at student protest or the number of them, or student challenges or student walkouts or media coverage that all of a sudden makes it, this is one of those instances that now we need to make a statement on. I think it's unfortunate that we may have to look for that volume or that number, but I certainly think that's one thing. I think if an institution is being asked by its student body or even its employees about, for example, the George Floyd situation and the safety of Black men and the concerns about police brutality and how do we respond to that as we're educating a lot of young Black men or men of color on our campus, I think it's appropriate. I know that it's a tough situation, and I've often had to counsel on that. But I think there are appropriate statements that can be made that do not necessarily put an institution in this side or that side. Mm-hmm. Because we can all, in many situations, agree to the moral right of something, whether it's life, whether it's hurt. And the example you raised of the current crisis in Israel and the West Bank, and what does that mean in terms of folks who have been killed or being killed? I think it's hard for a higher education institution not to make some statement on that.
Right.
I just, to me, that would speak louder than making a statement.
Yeah. No comment. is a comment.
Is a comment.
Is a comment.
Yes.
And Frank, we appreciate your comments today. Thank you for joining us on the first edition of the Critical Conversations podcast. Frank, you are our first guest, man.
All right. I'm the guinea pig. I appreciate that. It really has been a pleasure for me. This is a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Listen, that's all the time we have for today, but I just want to say thank you for tuning in to the very first episode of the Critical Conversations podcast. I'd also like to give a special shout out to our producer, Eric Rohn, and special guest, Frank Garrett. Join us in January as we begin the second half of the academic year with a new episode and some fresh insight on DEI-related topics. Again, thank you, and have a happy holiday season. Peace.